Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm pleased you joined us today. My name is Ron Hassner. I'm the Helen Diller Family Chair in Israel Studies at UC Berkeley. I'm also the co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies here on campus. And I'm glad you joined us today for a special webinar entitled A Follow-Up Conversation with David Horovitz, Editor-in-Chief of the Times of Israel. Our conversation will delve into the most pressing developments in Israeli politics and society in the context of the changing Middle East political landscape. As the editor-in-chief of a major Israeli newspaper, David will lend his editorial views to challenging topics in the news, both as they are covered within Israel and across the globe. This is the second of two programs with David Horovitz. He joined us for a first conversation in the fall of 2025, and you can find a recording of that first talk in the chat below. For the last 3 years, we've hosted Israeli journalists for a series of virtual webinars and in-person visits. Last year, we hosted Nadav Eyal, winner of the Sokolov Award, which is a Israeli journalism award, and the year before, Haviv Rettig-Gur, a political correspondent with the Times of Israel. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little about our institute. We provide a rich academic forum for students and faculty through two programs, one in Israel Studies, the other in Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity. Our institute houses an undergraduate fellowship consisting of 35 students. We bring faculty from Israeli and American universities to teach and conduct research at Berkeley. We also host the university's undergraduate minor in Israel Studies, and we offer dozens of lectures and programs for the public and campus communities. We have had a full semester of programs trying to make sense of the war in Iran, the ceasefire in Gaza, Israel's relationship with the European Union, divisions in the Jewish world, Judaism as a religion, nation, or law, and literary approaches to our current moment. And we're going to conclude the semester with the last talk in our literary series on October, which started with October 7, and that talk will happen on April 20. You can find past talks, future talks, recordings, all on our website, and you'll see the links below in our chat. All of these programs, all of these activities, all the events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from our community, and we thank you for that support. Okay, to David, I'm honored to welcome David Horovitz. He is the founding editor of the Times of Israel from 2012. He is the author of Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, which came out in 2004, and A Little Too Close to God, The Thrills and Panic of a Life in Israel, that came out in 2000. And he's the co-author of Shalom Friend, The Life and Legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. He previously edited the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. He is the recipient of the U.S. National Jewish Book Award and the B'nai Brit Lifetime Achievement Award for Journalism. I'm going to be chatting with David on a range of issues, but we would also invite you to ask your own questions by typing them into the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen or into the chat. I probably won't be able to ask all your questions on your behalf, but I will try to cover as many issues as possible. So thank you, David, for joining.
It's a pleasure, Ron. Nice to be with you.
I guess before I ask you questions about current events, which and there are many current events, not a quiet moment. I guess I wanted to ask you a question about the Times of Israel and also an opportunity to sort of tell people about the Times of Israel. And I don't mean that question as an excess in flattery, but I do feel that it is the one newspaper that every English reading person should open once a day if they want to learn about Israel. And my question is this: why and how do you ensure the neutrality and professionalism of the Times of Israel in a period in which so many other newspapers have taken the easy path out and are pandering to narrow specific audiences? I mean, surely there are risks involved and challenges involved in trying to maintain a sort of very careful, as much as possible, apolitical, neutral, fair line I don't know of another Israeli newspaper that has managed that as well as the Times of Israel. So can you tell us a little about, you know, how you did this, and what the challenges are on a daily basis?
Well, I take that as a compliment, and I don't think we're perfect, but we strive to be certainly the things like fair, and we strive to be reliable. And I'm not sure about neutrality. I'll come back to that. In terms of I thought it was very important when I founded the Times of Israel that there would be a media outlet that was genuinely independent. I mean, our mistakes are our own. We're not enthralled to any political party. I have a partner who has invested in the Times of Israel, but the editorial operation is a totally independent operation, and like I say, our mistakes are our own. I write an op-ed every week, almost every week. So, I take a position, and as the editor, I mean, I think that colors the way people see the site. But in terms of our reporting, I genuinely don't know the politics of at least some of our reporters, and in their news reporting, I don't want to know the politics. They should be reporting as honestly and accurately as they can. We mark pieces that are analytical as analysis pieces. We mark pieces by staff that are opinion, and they're quite rare. I'm the person who writes the most of those. We mark them as op-ed if they are opinion pieces, and we have a very, I mean, incredibly diverse blog platform. And those blog posts, which are third-party content, they're not by our staff, they're marked differently, they look differently. So we try to explain to people, even in the language of the site, what it is they're reading. And I think in this, Israel is an incredibly divided country, and I think it's quite important to have something that is not trying to steer you one way or another because of a political affiliation. In terms of the challenge, I mean, one of the huge challenges of journalism generally now is you have to be really fast to be relevant, and you have to be really accurate to have any value. And those are contradictory challenges, if you like, or values. You could spend. I mean, I used to, in a former life, edit a print newspaper, and it would close at midnight. And although there was a website and it was still going, in my own psyche, it was done for the day, kind of thing. So it's never done for the day. We're a 24/7 website, but the news in any case, and the time zones, it's non-stop. And you don't have the luxury in reporting the news of saying, well, we'll come back to that in a couple of hours if it's something really important. And I could go on a lot about this, but I'll keep it, fairly brief. We're also in a situation where we often see material that first of all, that we can't verify. Covering the war in Gaza is incredibly difficult. We don't have a full-time reporter in Gaza, not for lack of wanting one, but because you can't. Reporters, our military reporter has been in many, many times, but he sees what the army wants him to see. And even things that we would have thought they would have every interest in showing us, they don't always show us. You're covering a war now. I mean, I challenge most people to know exactly what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz in the last 24 hours or so, since an American blockade apparently went into force. It seems to have gone into force. But, even things like that, it's hard to know. And if you wait until things are definitive, you may be reporting very little of what matters. And we now, the challenge sometimes of seeing material appearing and being very widely read that we have a pretty shrewd idea is not true. If we can debunk it, and it's important to do so, we'll write about it. But often we can't be completely sure. That's another challenge. So, I appreciate what you said. I really do. It matters a great deal. We have a fantastic team of journalists, quite a small team, but an amazing team, really world-class reporters and editors. And it's hard work. There's no doubt about that. It's really hard
Is
work.
there a pressure from readers, from advertisers, from public figures to try to pull the paper in one direction or another?
Um, Not, I think probably more in the past. I think public figures probably know that there's no point. We've had, I mean, I'll give you a really crazy story, which you may have heard about, which is that our military reporter was drawn into a massive, rather or deeply unpleasant, I would say, incident involving Polemarket, where his coverage of the war was central to hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars in bets, because he quite routinely reported a missile that landed near Bet Shemesh a few weeks ago. It was allowed to land because headed into open territory. Israel's policy is it doesn't fire interceptors at missiles and rockets that it is certain will not cause harm to life and limb. And I think there are other considerations. The bottom line is this missile was allowed to fall, and therefore there was a missile impact in Israel that day, and that affected lots of people's winnings and losings. And he had death threats. So, we get that kind. I mean, that's radically unusual. We get told that we're very left wing and that we're very right wing, which, like, is I would say is a necessary but not sufficient condition. In other words, if we only got it from one side,
Yep.
we would be doing something wrong. But yeah, that's the sort of the way it is when you're trying to do your work honestly, and as long as you feel that that's what you're doing, you deal with those challenges.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate the sort of meta theoretical answer. You're talking about most recent events first. The meeting in Washington D.C. between the Lebanese ambassador, the Israeli ambassador, I think has ended. Do you have a notion about the sort of the purpose of that meeting, and do you have an instinct about whether there is indeed a united Israeli-Lebanese front here against Hezbollah?
So first of all, I think it ended just a few minutes ago, just before we started this webinar. I think it lasted for a couple of hours, and I think that was it's neither means that it was a success or a failure. I assume if it had ended after 5 minutes, we would have known it was very unsuccessful. I'm sure we'll hear more. I think this was a historic meeting because ostensibly, I mean, the way Secretary of State Rubio presented it, this was trying to deal with, trying to achieve peace, trying to um, prevent Hezbollah from owning that, a conflict, if you like, because Hezbollah is trying to destroy Israel. And the remarkable thing, I think, is that broadly, I would say the initiative for this level. I mean, this is two ambassadors meeting, but the goal is to do something substantive. That it came from Lebanon. Israel does not want Hezbollah on its northern border. It had a peace treaty, I mean, a ceasefire treaty in 2024, under which the Lebanese army, so the Lebanese government's military arm, was supposed to disarm Hezbollah. It was supposed to dismantle Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. It really hasn't played out. Hezbollah is quite strong and fairly ruthless, and the Lebanese army has limitations. And what you've got here really is you've got, I mean, when this conflict began, the Lebanese government urged, well, I'm talking about the Israeli-American joint strikes on Iran at the end of February, the government of Lebanon pleaded with Hezbollah not to join in and not to drag Lebanon into a war. And Hezbollah ignored the pleadings of the government and started attacking Israel. And Israel hit back, and things have been playing out very violently ever since. And the Lebanese government basically has taken a very brave stand because it's not a powerhouse government. It is not, a relaxedly sovereign power. It's a government in a country with, a Shiite third, a Sunni third, and a Christian third, broadly speaking. And the Shiite third are broadly speaking supportive of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has been able to rebuild to quite a strikingly alarming level since it was pretty heavily attacked by Israel um, in the aftermath of October the 7th, again, when it piled into a war. And so you've got a government that is failing to do what, in theory, wants to be able to do, which is to marginalize a terrorist army in its own country. You've got an Israel that would also like Hezbollah to be beyond marginalized, not to be a threat. So there's common interest here. How that plays out, we shall see. Israel, I'm sure, if I don't imagine the talks were hugely substantive over the 2 hours, but if and when they become substantive, the message from Israel will be, we would like to partner you all the way to a stable peace, but you don't seem to have the capacity to bring calm to the south of your country and the north of ours. If there's lots of goodwill, the conversations will be, well, how do we go about achieving that? And Israel, you've got a very wary Israel that's, not going to be prepared to say, well, if you promise us you'll do a better job now, then fine. Israel's going to be saying, look, this hasn't really worked. Um, how are you going to be able to do better? How can we work together with you? Here are the things that we see as vital to our interests. We recognize that some of them are in your interests as well. Maybe many of them are in your interests. Um, Again, to come back to the beginning of my answer, the striking thing, I think, is the degree to which the government in Lebanon is basically um, saying to Hezbollah, we're not going to be intimidated by you. The chief of Hezbollah a few hours ago was accusing the government of all manner of crimes, not the Israeli government, the Lebanese government, of bowing to Israel and the United States and surrendering and defeatism and so on, and acting against Lebanese interests. There's a real challenge here in the very fact that they wanted to be in these talks, came to these talks, and like I say, we'll see if there's any substance that comes out of them.
It seems like a fantastic opportunity, both because Hezbollah it may have rearmed, but it's weaker than it's been in a while. It cannot access Iranian weapons and funds as easily because the Syrian land bridge is gone. Iran itself, I don't think, is particularly capable right now of bolstering Hezbollah in any particular way. Um, but it's at the same time, it's not entirely clear to me what Israel's goals are in southern Lebanon. Is the notion weakening Hezbollah further, disarming Hezbollah, taking out its more of its leadership?
Look, Hezbollah was massively degraded by Israel in the course of 2024, basically. The key leaders were killed, much of their missile capacity was destroyed. There was this beeper operation in which thousands of people's relatively primitive beepers blew up on them. And this was quite stunning in that it was Hezbollah operatives and, broadly speaking, nobody else who was hurt. I mean, thousands of people. And this was an operation where Israel has essentially managed to sell Hezbollah the beepers laced with explosives that blew up its operatives because they were so paranoid about having their more sophisticated communication devices targeted against them. And yet here we are, not so many months later, and Hezbollah, it's not the force that it was. It potentially could have been firing, I don't know, vast numbers of missiles and rockets everywhere in Israel, and yet it's been able for 6 weeks now to pummel the north of Israel. And we have the relative luxury the further south you go in this current iteration of war, that we have warnings. When Iran fires a missile, it's spotted very early. We've had a series of alerts where there's an initial alert where a missile launch is detected, and then there's a more specific alert later on if it's heading into your area. And we also, of course, have the world's best array of defenses. They're not hermetic. We've had people killed in Israel, of course, but I don't want to use the relative luxury is a ridiculous term to use of warnings and protections. But in northern Israel, they're being battered all the time. There were like five alarms, one after the other, a couple of hours ago, with actual rockets heading, the fairly short distance. They don't have sufficient time in many cases to seek shelter. There are occasions when there's no alarm or alert sounded at all because something isn't detected or because the proximity is such that there isn't time. It's broadly speaking somewhat unlivable, maybe worse than that, in much of the north, and it has been for weeks. And this is, as you rightly say, this is a weakened Hezbollah. I think Iran has been able to transfer money. Clearly, Hezbollah has been able to rebuild some of its missile capability. The impression that Israelis had as of 18 months ago was that Hezbollah was much weakened and, broadly speaking, out of the game. I think that's what most Israelis believed or wanted to believe. And that clearly isn't the case. So what does Israel want to do? It wants to put Hezbollah out of the killing Israelis business, as it has sought to do in Gaza with Hamas. Um, I don't want to I don't want to say with more or less, but also without definitive success, that's for sure. I think people were aware of the challenge posed by Hamas, which still controls half of Gaza and in that area most of Gazans. I think Israelis were more upbeat about Hezbollah being weakened, and this has been a shock as well as really dangerous for people in northern Israel.
Thank you. So questions are starting to pour in. Let's go back a little, and this is a question from the audience, sort of setting the background for the United States Israel attack on Iran. Um, a good deal of in my mind, distortion, misrepresentation, politicking around who took the lead here and whether this was an American operation with Israeli, maybe even Saudi support, or an Israeli operation and the United States got dragged into it, or cooperation among equals in that sense. Do you have a notion about where this idea of attacking Iran came from and which dog is wagging which tail?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, I don't have definitive information on every aspect of this, but there's stuff that I know, and there's also common sense. I don't think there is any credible narrative where Israel forces an unwilling American administration into this war. Um, I'm certain that there was a great deal of conversation. I imagine that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has for decades warned of the threat of this regime getting weapons of mass destruction, I'm sure um, he was a powerful advocate as he was last year. Remember, in June, and we're talking sort of nine months or 10 months ago, um, there was a shorter war, and the United States joined in at the very end and targeted um, major Iranian nuclear facilities. I think there was, since then, an Israeli intelligence assessment that that the regime was becoming acutely dangerous again. I can't imagine that the United States would have um, been dismissive of that, or that they wouldn't have had their own intelligence. I think it was probably oversold from what I can gather. Maybe, I don't know. I think there was probably a greater sense in Israel, certainly from Netanyahu, I believe, that there was potential to create a circumstance in which the regime would fall. But if you look at what was said by both Netanyahu and Trump on that first day, on February the 28th, both of them focused on Iran's nuclear ambitions, its enrichment capabilities, its missile capabilities, its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and its capacity to export terrorism and terrorize the world, and said, we also hope that by the time the bombs stop falling, our bombs stop falling, the conditions will be created in which the Iranian public can oust this leadership that has been murdering them by the tens of thousands. I think my understanding is that there was probably a greater confidence on Netanyahu's part than there was on the American side that that was going to happen. It hasn't happened. Uh, it's by no means certain that it will happen. I think it was interesting today that the head of the Mossad, a man named David Barnea, who's would have been central to any assessments about what was likely to unfold and how it could unfold, um, he made some very cryptic remarks about it was always, our belief that, I'm paraphrasing, developments would continue even after the military operation was over, and our work would not be done and is not done until or unless this incredibly dangerous um, regime is ousted. So I thought that was quite interesting. There's been a bit of sort of behind the scenes suggestions that Netanyahu is blaming Mr. Barnea for being too upbeat about the possibility of rapid regime change. And Mr. Barnea, it would seem today, was kind of saying, we never said this was going to happen like right away. And we still think it is quite likely that it will happen. So there's a lot of, I mean, there's more. Where was the strategic planning? Whoever was pushing harder. Everyone seems to have been surprised at Iran's capacity to wreak havoc via the Strait of Hormuz, when you would have thought that was a fairly predictable potential consequence of the attack. Um,
Extremely predictable.
there's, sorry?
Extremely predictable.
Right. So, what do you make of that? And there's we heard in the last few hours, I think, Donald Trump talking about the possibility of the talks that were suspended or abandoned after just one day in Pakistan, about them resuming. I think both sides are seem to be seeking a deal. And the question arises, given that there wasn't adequate strategic planning, as far as I can tell, and given that the regime is still in power, and given that its nuclear capabilities were pretty battered last time rather than this time. If you think of what's been targeted, you haven't really had um, a focus on destroying nuclear sites more than they were damaged, again, on the whole, last June. The question is whether things will wind up to have been worse than if there had been no resort to force this time. Because if, for example, the regime survives, which it seems to be now, and there's a desire for a deal, is there going to be a better deal than the one that Trump withdrew from, the Obama deal, which was very problematic? These are questions that are starting to arise now. There are reports, not confirmed, that, for example, the United States is adamant that the 60% enriched uranium must be removed, and that is really critical because that's the quickest path for Iran to the bomb, and you don't need massive infrastructure to move from that to take that stockpile into something
Right.
that can become a nuclear weapon. But there are reports that America is saying, we're not going to insist that you have no right to enrich, which was an original position. Rather, you won't enrich for 20 years. There are some interesting positions taking shape here that I think would be very worrying to not just the Israeli government, but to Israelis on the whole. The opposition in Israel was supportive of this resort to force and has now been witheringly critical of the way it has played out.
So here's a harder question. I mean, it's you and I can guess forever as to what Netanyahu's goals were, what Trump's goals were, because if only because their rhetoric is confusing on this issue. So I have a harder question for you. What do you think the goals should have been? Uh, just to give you an example, in my mind, it's not clear that Israel desires regime change in Iran as opposed to regime weakening in Iran.
Well, if you're asking me what I think the goals should be, I don't know that this was the time to do it, and I don't think this was the way to do it. But I think the goals, and I don't think this is just for Israelis, I think the goal of the free world, and certainly it's the goal of most Iranians, as far as we can tell, is indeed that this regime must go. These are bad people. They're rapacious ideologically, but they're rapacious territorially. They're terrible to their own people. They kill them in the tens of thousands. They're misogynistic, homophobic, oppressive. I mean, these are bad people. And they are exporting terrorism and have done for half a century, and they are trying to get a nuclear weapon. And I don't know that they wouldn't use it, and they would be invulnerable if they had it, even if they didn't use it. And they lied about their missile capabilities, and of course, they turned out to be able to hit Europe, which nobody here really doubted. They would like to do terrible things to the big Satan as well, the great Satan. We, as you know, we're the little Satan next door. They can hit us at will. They were hitting us throughout this war, even until the ceasefire, despite Israeli-American air supremacy. They want to destroy this country and they want to do great harm to your country, as far as I can tell. And again, I come back to, in terms of international um, perception of this, they are terrible to their own people. I mean, they not only do they allocate resources to a war machine rather than take care of their own people, they're murderous towards their own people. So again, you were asking me, what do I think the goal needs to be? Ultimately, it needs to be that this regime is no longer ruling Iran. Whether this resort to force was sensibly timed, not certain, strategically planned, would seem to not be the case. So that's incredibly problematic.
Questions are pouring in, and one question from an audience member is whether Israel is likely to continue attacking Iran if the United States decides to cut some sort of a deal, and what such a deal might look like regarding the Straits of Hormuz.
I mean, the first thing I should stress in trying to deal with questions about what may or may not happen is to stress how it's not that I don't know. Nobody knows because some of the things that relate to that question, for example, I don't think the people who will have to make the decisions necessarily know. I don't know how the Strait of Hormuz is going to pan out. I've heard the leader of the free world saying, if anyone should be charging tolls on the Strait of Hormuz, it should be us. I've heard him joking that maybe it'll be me and the next Ayatollah, whoever that is. I mean, you would put those things aside, but he's the president of the United States, and it just underlines, like I said, before, I don't know for certain what's even been going on in the Strait of Hormuz, and that is information that is out there. You just have to pore over it, and work out the times and so on. So it's very hard to tell in terms of whether Israel um, would be bound. I mean, Israel was bound. I would certainly say reluctantly. That would be my sense that Netanyahu reluctantly accepted the ceasefire, and I don't think he would. I cannot see unless there was a sense that hey, this is immediate existential danger, that he would defy President Trump, whose alliance is central for him, um, central to, I would say, to a potentially very problematic degree because President Trump will not be the president of the United States forever. And the alliance needs to, Israel's relationship with the United States needs to thrive beyond the Trump administration, and it is plainly not thriving beyond the Trump administration right now. But I also think that if Israel believed that there was an existential threat and it was credible, and it was a credible assessment, I cannot imagine Israel having to defy the Trump administration. I'd like to think all successive administrations, if the future of the country was in existential danger, you would hope that there would be support, participation, and if neither of those, at least consent for Israel doing what it would deem necessary to defend itself.
Uh, but in that case, some sort of a long-term ceasefire scenario with Iran, I imagine Israel would insist on continuing its operations in Lebanon. Um, one of our audience members identifies as a Lebanese Christian and wonders how such a disarmament of Hezbollah could even come about, given how weak the Lebanese military is, and given the difficulties that Israel has faced so far.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And Israel and at least part of Lebanon and this government, to some extent, maybe to even an extent unprecedented for several decades, have been trying to grapple with it. I mean, Israel's got a very worrying history in Lebanon of trying to, in one case, of course, install or help install a leadership that it believed would be acting in its clear interests, and that failed. Um, Israel maintained a security zone, as many of you will know, um, for almost 20 years in southern Lebanon, and that didn't work out well ultimately. In that there were about 30 Israeli soldiers being killed every year in that security zone, and a movement led by it was called the Four Mothers Movement kind of pushed Israel to pull back, and it basically rushed back to the border. As its allies in something called the South Lebanon Army basically felt abandoned, and that proxy militia, if you like, that collapsed. And now Israel is venturing again with ground forces into southern Lebanon to try to reduce the threat to northern Israel. There is Hezbollah fire nonetheless coming from southern Lebanon, but there's also Hezbollah fire coming from deeper in Lebanon. And therefore, the question is a better question than my answer can be, because it is not clear how, unless you have a partnership that has to involve the United States, and has to be really credible, where you have Israel, the Lebanese government, and international players with genuine, assistance. I couldn't begin to describe how this might play out to help empower the Lebanese government to achieve sovereignty, and marginalize Hezbollah. This is a colossal challenge. Hezbollah is much weaker than it was, but it is still potent. Southern Lebanon, I'm sure the Israeli army would tell you about, and we see, hour by hour almost, reports of this and that target hit. But that's would seem to be like an endless battle when it's a territory in which you are not, the dominant military force on the ground. So it's much easier to say Israel wants to, disarm or to see Hezbollah disarmed. The Lebanese government, I think, like I say, unlike for many, many years, has taken a very brave stance and said that's our goal as well. There is public pressure within Lebanon. Again, I don't have a reporter in Beirut, But the footage you can see, and you see people in Beirut who were incredibly unhappy that this war came their way as well, who have been very critical of Hezbollah, who are prepared to be publicly critical. I've seen, news anchors who I would have thought were taking considerable personal risk, challenging representatives of Hezbollah. I'm talking Lebanese news anchors on television, challenging people speaking up on behalf of or actually representing Hezbollah and accusing them of, doing terrible harm to the country. So there would appear to be mounting will, and therefore the challenge is to find the way.
On the topic of will, support for both of these fronts, I guess there's a third one we haven't talked about yet, remains high in Israel, which is amazing after 2.5 years.
Well, it has been, I mean, you're right to say 2.5 years because you're going back to the Hamas invasion on October the 7th, 2023. It is a little over 2.5 years now. And um, we had a relative semi-respite for just a few weeks. I mean, the last living hostages were freed by Hamas as part of a ceasefire arrangement on October the 13th of last year. So we had a few weeks, months of relative calm, but nothing that felt solid, and lots of concerns about what was playing out in Gaza, that Hamas was not giving up its arms, and all the potential international stabilization forces and technocrats committees. They have not been able to even in most cases even enter the territory. So that continued to be worrying, and now we've had this major escalation. I think the support, and it is high. It's not as high as it was week by week. Um, was because of the picture I gave you. I think about concerns about the regime in Iran. Israelis feel that Iran under this regime wants to kill us all. We take that seriously, and a war that was understood by Israelis to be aimed at making sure that was not going to be possible, was pretty widely supported and is still widely supported. The fall off of support I'm assessing is because Israelis are increasingly becoming convinced that that's not what's going to happen, at least not in the short term. And the Lebanon frontier, like I said before as well, it's shocking for most Israelis how much Hezbollah has been able to terrorize the north when most people thought it wouldn't be able to do that as dramatically as it has been able to.
One of our undergraduate fellows wonders how all this bodes for Netanyahu in forthcoming elections.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And
They're smart, our undergraduate fellows.
well, a good question being one that, of course, I can't answer. Um, but I appreciate that it's right to ask it. Um, and you can shut me up because I have a tendency to ramble on. So I'll try and tell you what I think are some salient points. First of all, if you look at our opinion polls, there's not much chance that he retains power, but you should be incredibly skeptical of opinion polls. Remember that you have so many parties that run in Israeli elections. You've never had single party government here. I think there are about a dozen parties in the Knesset right now, with 120 seats between them. That's the parliament. So there's no single majority party. Netanyahu's Likud in the polls is, would be won't get as much as a quarter of the seats in parliament. He'd have to build a coalition, and all the polls have him in the low 50s out of those 120. Him and his supporting parties. So that means he's finished, right? Except you can't believe the polls. Their own margin of errors are pretty high, but you're polling ultra Orthodox Jews, you're polling Arabs. Ultra Orthodox Jews probably don't answer the phone in proportionately equivalent degrees to the rest of Israelis. Do they really have lots of Arab speakers doing the polling? They do snap polls by telephone and by internet. They're supposedly, weighed properly and so on. But 500 people in a snap poll. There are all kinds of quirks of the Israeli system. There's a 3.25% threshold. If you get more than 3.25% votes nationwide, you get seats in the Knesset. If you fall one vote short of that threshold, all those votes are thrown away. So that would remake your polls pretty significantly. Parties can join together. Technically, it's called a technical merger just for election day, and then separate afterwards. So if they're worried they're going to fall below the threshold, they join up with another ideologically similar party, they clear the threshold together and break up. And yet, two of the Netanyahu allied parties are polling, with one of them doing pretty well on the far right, and another far right party falling below the threshold. Well, that's not going to be what happens on election day. They'll merge. Those votes won't be thrown away, and therefore there'll be another two or three seats that, even if the polls are accurate, they didn't take into account. Those are just a few little pointers. Then you have the fact that Netanyahu is an incredibly energetic and, by comparison, peerless politician by comparison to the opposition, and that the opposition is incredibly divided. And I can list you easily four people who think that they should and could be prime minister. Uh, Naftali Bennett, who's from the political right but is opposed to Netanyahu. Gadi Eisenkot, who's a former chief of staff, somewhere in the center left. Avigdor Lieberman, who is right wing, a settler, very opposed to Netanyahu. And there's a guy called Yair Golan, who's heading what became of the Labour Party and Meretz, so a center left party and a left wing party. All four of them would like to be prime minister. I don't think any of the four of them are particularly. Oh, I didn't even mention Yair Lapid, who happens to be the opposition leader, somewhere in the center. They're all, taking pot shots at each other as well as at Netanyahu. It's pretty, it's a pretty bleak picture if you're looking at an opposition to get it together and oust Netanyahu. Instead, you see a very disunited opposition and Netanyahu with partners who really have no other coalition to join. That was the case when Netanyahu came back to power at the end of 2022. The two ultra-Orthodox parties, the two far-right parties, they're not going to sit with anybody else. So I wouldn't write him off, even though the polls would tell you that you should. I didn't even mention the Arab parties, which are heading for somewhere between, hard to tell, but maybe 10 to 15, maybe slightly more even. One of them sat in the previous Bennett-Lapid government. I don't think Bennett at least is saying he wouldn't sit with any of the non-Zionist, i.e. Arab parties in the future. So even though, like I say, Netanyahu is in the low 50s, that high 60s of forces arrayed against him will not all sit together in a coalition. So it becomes more complicated for the anti-Netanyahu camp to actually get the votes together to oust Netanyahu. And I didn't, one last thing, sorry. In the context of the war, in the context of October the 7th, why is it? The question is, if Netanyahu was elected in late 2022, why am I saying don't write him off? Because obviously, to my mind, at the very least, you would expect that he would be finished after October the 7th. He presided over the failure to prevent the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, the worst attack on civilians, really the worst attack that Israel has known in its modern history. He was at the head of the hierarchy. He's basically blamed everybody else, and almost everybody else in positions of real power has stepped down. He's still there, and the buck stops with him. So you would think the assumption would be that he is finished, but that is not the case. He's definitely weaker, but he's certainly not finished.
Yeah. Um, and while everybody's attention is elsewhere, there's very significant unrest in the West Bank, initiated primarily by Israeli settlers, and no willingness by the government to put any sort of constraints on that violence. Um, how do you explain that?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit too definitive, but it's not a million miles away from the mark. It's not I mean, Hamas is a potent force in the West Bank. There is Palestinian terrorism in the West Bank. It is a dismal reality that the focus of concern um, and even the higher casualties and fatalities of late has been Jewish terrorism. And I say that because it's been directed in many cases against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank by extremist settlers. I think there were 7 fatalities in the month of March. That's the last monthly figure that I know of. And as this war was unfolding, the army um, is devoting resources to try and fight Iran, to tackle Hezbollah, but it's also having to allocate more resources than it would have than one would have thought would have been necessary if one didn't know stuff that it would have wanted to try to deal with settler extremism, deadly settler extremism, and there is pretty clear room for criticism of the army's inability to do that. In other words, there is no clear sense that the army has been definitively capable. I mean, it certainly hasn't been definitively capable of cracking down, of preventing um, terrorist attacks by Jews on Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. And there's concern that it hasn't really been trying as hard as it should. Um, and then I mean, the fact is that there are relatively few arrests, very few convictions, a sense of an indulgence, and a growing sense of an agenda driving this on the part of the most extreme settlers, which is to make life unlivable in the West Bank for the Palestinians as a whole. An effort essentially to force Palestine to force the transfer is the euphemistic way of putting it. Um, this is an escalating phenomenon. It's terribly bad from every point of view. I think for Israel. And another really dismaying factor, I think, is the degree to which the mainstream leadership of the settlement movement has not taken a consistent, public, clear stand against this. There are figures in the settlement enterprise. There's a former leader of the settlement movement, a man called Pinchas Wallerstein, who a couple of days ago came out and was very critical of this. But the movement as a whole has not sufficiently dissociated itself from the Jewish terrorists, ostensibly acting in the interests of West Bank settlement. I mean, there's a massive historical context that we could get into, but that's the big picture, and it's incredibly damaging for Israel itself internally, for its moral soul, and it's incredibly damaging in terms of allies of Israel who are rightly deeply discomforted by it, dismayed by it, horrified by it, including the Trump administration, including the German government, which is extraordinarily supportive of Israel in a broad philosophical and practical way because of the quote unquote special relationship that stems from the Holocaust. Even Israel's closest allies, I would say to their credit, have made clear that this is just terrible. And what are you going to do about it? I'm pretty sure that it's been discussed at the highest levels between Israel and the United States. And as we know, this administration in the United States is broadly extremely supportive of Israel.
Um, this administration is, but we're seeing trends in American society that are less supportive. And one question coming from our audience is what role American media plays in turning Israel into a rallying point, including a rallying point for movements that have absolutely no relationship to the Middle East, whether it's climate activists, LGBTQ activists, U.S. domestic racial campaigns, racial justice campaigns. Um, so I'm wondering what you think about those trends, whether they're inevitable, and getting back to my very first question to you, what you think the role of the U.S. media is in framing issues as a way to inflame audiences in the United States, whether they are um, sort of hapless and aren't quite aware that they're putting a finger on the scale, or whether they're intentionally trying to inflame their readership on a popular topic.
Okay, I mean these are huge questions, and I'll do my best. Okay, so I think the first thing that I would do is um, establish a little bit of a base here, and say that I mean you're speaking to me, so I guess for me personally, there are aspects of Israel's governance and policy domestically that are incredibly troubling. I mean, I'm really very, very worried and very unhappy with our leadership at the moment. It's somewhat dysfunctional at any practical level, which is, pretty dismal too. But it's threatening democracy in Israel as far as I assess it. We don't really have three branches of government. We only have two because the parliament is a tool of a majority coalition if that coalition is pretty solid. So whatever the coalition wants to do, it can get through the Knesset. Broadly speaking, we don't have a constitution. The only break on political power, the power of the political majority, of the elected political majority, is the judiciary. And this coalition has been battering the judiciary and trying to discredit it from the moment it took office. And there's a big argument, by the way, that that sort of emboldened Hamas and Israel took its eyes off the ball because it was so torn apart about this battle for our democratic essence. So it's a really problematic government. We talked about settler extremism. We didn't talk about another incredibly divisive factor, which is the skewing of Jewish values by the ultra-Orthodox leadership. Much of the ultra-Orthodox leadership in Israel, the fastest growing community. It's very rending for Israeli society that you have a fast-growing community with very cynical political leadership living off the state and not serving in the army. And that's terrible because most Israelis are, there's not a family in Israel that doesn't have somebody serving in the army, doing reserve duty, or having done so, fairly recently. So domestically, Israel has real problems, but at the same time, Israel has incredibly dangerous enemies, and they're trying to wipe it out. And they are led by Iran. And that's a fact. Ask the Iranians; they'll tell you, yeah, we're trying to destroy Israel. We've done everything we can to destroy Israel. We don't even have an absolute religious affinity with Hamas, for example, but we've certainly been supporting them because they're trying to destroy Israel. We built Hezbollah to help us destroy Israel, to make it harder for Israel to harm us, and so on. And this is a country that's not here as some sort of colonial implant, as many of Israel's critics would have you believe, but as the only place on earth where the Jewish nation was ever sovereign, never willingly left, and always prayed to return, and quite stunningly managed to do that, like uniquely survived around a faith for a couple of millennia, and then was belatedly allowed to revive after the Holocaust. But this is the only place where the Jews are sovereign. It's the only place with a Jewish majority. Um, it has absolute legitimacy as a sovereign entity, as far as I'm concerned, and yet it is quite widely traduced and misrepresented, including because of very effective Palestinian-led propaganda for decades, and a lot of useful idiots who don't look closely about the placards they're carrying and might even not want to see Israel wiped out, but are still carrying a placard that says "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which means actually we would like to see Israel eliminated. So there's propaganda, there's anti-Semitism in that mix as well, for sure. If your only obsession is the Jewish state and you don't mind injustice anywhere else in the world, for example, nobody was much bothered that Iran's regime had killed tens of thousands of its own people, um, deliberately killed by their own regime. Certainly no comparable outrage to that which has accompanied the Israeli response to Hamas's invasion marginalized Israel's response front and center. There was hostility to Israel's effort to defang Hamas when Hamas was promising, "We'll do this again if we can." There was hostility to Israel's response from the very day that Hamas invaded. It wasn't as a consequence of how Israel prosecuted the war. It was Israel shouldn't have the right to defend itself. So there's some staggering stuff going on that involves malicious agendas, anti-Semitism, and a great deal of useful idiocy. There are other players in this. There's, Turkey and Qatar and people with a lot of resources that have put a lot of resources. In the case of Qatar, I'm not the first person to tell you about funding in American campuses and so on. There's a huge battle here. And Israel, by the way, is pretty lousy at public advocacy, doesn't take it seriously enough, doesn't allocate resources to it. So it doesn't help itself anywhere near as much as it can. And in terms, and what you see now is you see this kind of horseshoe effect of far left and far right disagreeing on pretty much everything except their hostility to and efforts to demonize Israel. So it's pretty dire. In terms of media, there's it's it, there are media outlets that seem to be framing everything in as problematic a way as they can for Israel, even at the expense. I mean, journalism to my mind, it's supposed to involve, trying to get to the heart of what really matters, to present it fairly and to contextualize it fairly. And there's never going to be absolute agreement about what constitutes the lead to a story, what constitutes a fair interpretation of what's going on, what constitutes necessary context. I mean, I suppose to some extent, um, you'd want thousands of years of Jewish history in the Holy Land included in every news agency piece about attacks on Israel. That's not going to happen, obviously, and that's not being realistic. But the way you present things and the context in which you present them is critical. And there are clearly media outlets that are making Israel look as bad as they can. And there are times when Israel can look bad. And there are times when Israel can look bad and shouldn't, but it didn't explain properly. And there are times when Israel really has nothing bad about a certain sequence of events, and yet is misrepresented. And I think there's a line that's been there for decades about, Israel is the mighty player compared to the Palestinians. And therefore, if after relinquishing all the territory it captured in 67, which it relinquished a great deal of course, peace with Egypt and withdrawing from Gaza, if it were to pull back unilaterally from the West Bank and give the Palestinians their state, and then was in terrible existential trouble because really bad people took over there, as they took over in Gaza, for example, then we'd give Israel, better press, but we'd possibly be on the brink of extinction. And right now, when you're looking at an Israel that's facing a regime in Iran, a country with massive resources, huge amounts of money, that has been terrible to its own people as it seeks to wipe out Israel, it seems to me harder to make even a pathetic case for Israel being constantly the bad side of this. It's certainly not the Goliath against an Iranian David, the way it is, um, the way people have tried to portray Israel as a Goliath against the Palestinian David. I mean, we're up against a devastatingly powerful, very dangerous regime that's horrible to its own people. So it's kind of hard to understand that framing, especially in this conflict, in any kind of, you know, what I would consider to be a responsible journalistic basis.
Yeah, except of course that the Israeli rivalry with Iran and the Israeli attack on Iran is associated with Donald Trump, and for certain media outlets, everything that's associated with Donald Trump is automatically outrageous, unacceptable, appalling, immoral. And so, as you suggested a while ago in a prior answer, um, Israel tying its fortunes to this particular administration was a useful move in some ways, but also a very dangerous move. Do you have a notion about what the future brings for U.S. Israeli relations on the assumption that Trump does not run for a third term?
Yeah, I'm glad you added that caveat there. We have no term limits in Israel. You may or may not know, so which is not a good thing, I have to tell you.
Yep.
I think reasonable people should realize that even if you're the most decent and honorable and honest person, simply being in office for a long, long time, you build relationships, and those relationships have a potential to make bad things happen and skew your judgment and lead to abuse. Anyway, that was a digression. I think we I think Israelis and people who care about Israel can afford to be pretty pessimistic about the partnership, and I think it's a critical partnership. Um, to the extent that I think Netanyahu has done it, and there is a considerable extent, I think it's incredibly dangerous and short-sighted to not to be praising Donald Trump for doing things that most Israelis are incredibly supportive of, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, pretty high on that list. Um, Helping Israel to try to minimize the threat posed by Iran with all the caveats that I've expressed here. But an effort there to tackle a leadership that is trying to destroy this country. But there's a way to do it that does not alienate the rest of the political map more than is unavoidable given how partisan and shrill the climate of debate is in the United States. I mean, Israel was a bipartisan cause in a country where I suspect you know better than me. There are very few, if any, bipartisan causes. we are incredibly divided as well. One of our divides, I'm sure, it includes the degree to which the current Israeli government has done Israel a disservice in not doing its utmost to maximize bipartisan support in the United States.
Um, uh, Two big issues we haven't talked about. We're soon running out of time. And you've answered valiantly a string of, I don't know, 20, 30 questions by now. Um, we haven't talked about Turkey's role in all of these processes. It's certainly not playing a constructive role, and there's the Times of Israel has reported on increasingly militant language coming from Erdogan in the last few days, and yet at the same time, Turkey is a crucial player. Both in Syria, potentially in Lebanon, potentially in Gaza. Do you see any reason for hope there, or is Turkey just making things worse?
Medium and long term, I see potential for hope. I don't think Turkey is a lost cause. I actually think behind the scenes, there's probably a closer relationship. In some areas, even now, I wouldn't get carried away about that. And you're right about the rhetoric. And Erdogan is a supporter of Hamas. Um, so it's a pretty problematic relationship. I don't, like I said, I don't think it's a lost cause. There's been some stuff around in the last few days that I don't think that we haven't reported about some rhetoric that I don't think was accurate, but some of the rhetoric that has been accurately reported is pretty troubling. And Turkey is indeed, a very important player. And there are three sort of mighty populaces in this part of the world. If you think of Turkey and Egypt and Iran, um, Israel, we have a difficult relationship with Egypt. It's not dire, but it's not great. The relationship with Iran, please God, it should get much better. And it could. It's quite staggering indeed to see the degree. A lot of this is anecdotal, that the Iranian public as a whole, despite half a century of attempted indoctrination, does not seem to be sort of instinctively hostile to Israel. I think that's a fragile assessment, but I think that's probably reasonable at the moment. And we would like to have, a good relationship with Turkey, with which we did have good relations. I think Turkish Airlines was, after the Israeli airlines, I think it may have been the airline that most used Ben Gurion Airport until October the 7th. So we did have close ties, and they go up and down. And Erdogan hosted President Herzog in a quite good-natured meeting not so many years ago. So again, I don't think it's a lost cause. Certainly, relations are pretty dire at the moment.
Has this conflict pushed? This is another question from one of our undergraduate fellows. Has this conflict pushed Israel and Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, closer?
Well, first of all, there should be an understanding that there is a sort of CENTCOM overseen military relationship that predates this war for some years now. CENTCOM being the sort of the area of the US military that covers this part of the world, whereby the Saudis and other countries with whom Israel does not have relations, and those that with whom it does, like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, Syria's in there as well, by the way, where there's sort of defensive cooperation in terms of alerts and alarms, and maybe in in actual cases, certainly last year, some of the players in this region were involved in trying to help Israel ward off Iranian attacks in the past, drones and missiles and so on. So there is actually, a defensive partnership that extends beyond countries that are actually formally in diplomatic relations with Israel. I would wager, I mean, in the United Arab Emirates has been attacked by many more, multiply more Iranian missiles and drones than Israel in the conflict, which is quite stunning and quite staggering to them. Even Qatar has been attacked, which is absolutely incredible, as Iran tried to create a circumstance in which there would be pressure on the United States to halt the war. I think there was less said publicly than was being said privately about support in the Gulf for this fight, for the fight to go on, and to do everything possible to bring down the regime, or everything within reason to bring down the regime. And I suspect mounting disappointment that that's not going to happen in the near future. Um, I don't know how it plays out in terms of a genuine warming of relations. If like a lot hinges on how this ends. Donald Trump says that we've won. It's ridiculous. He gets very upset with any media that claims that America hasn't won. But he also says there's been regime change, and the fact is there hasn't been regime change. He says the new leaders are less radical and more reasonable. Well, they're not. The key person in Iran is the Speaker of the Parliament, who is a former Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander, directly responsible for killing Iranians, or for ordering the killing of Iranians, directly leading chants of death to America in the Iranian Parliament. This is not a new regime. This is the old regime, if anything, more extreme. And that's being seen around the Gulf, and there were countries, I'm sure, that hoped this would be the beginning of the end of their Iran regime problems, and they're wondering, at the very least, if that is not going to be the case. I wouldn't be definitive, by the way. I don't think we should be saying, "Oh, this regime is not going to collapse," but the fact is that the war is not ongoing at the moment, and the regime has certainly survived. And so I think there's, what they choose to do, how they build alliances in the future, how wary they will feel they need to be of this regime. The UAE was ahead of the Saudis. It made peace with Israel. It normalized relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia didn't do that, has come close. You might have thought early in this round of conflict that they would come closer still. Depending on how it plays out, they may actually retreat and retreat further from the orbit of the United States. A new administration will be less warmly disposed towards them, perhaps, than the Trump administration was. So there's so many uncertainties, but largely, I think, in the short term at least, they hinge on how this round of conflict ends, how robust the regime is, how barred it genuinely is from progressing towards a nuclear capability, and we don't know the answers to those questions yet.
One last question, since we're almost out of time, and you've been fantastic, David, in tolerating all my questions. I don't think we haven't talked about Gaza. It's true. There are questions in the audience that I haven't been able to get to about the death penalty, about unrest in the Arab community in Israel, and I apologize for not getting to all of them. But since you are there now, um, uh, can you tell us anything about sort of the general mood and disposition of Israelis after weeks and weeks, months and months of fighting? Do you sense resilience? Do you sense impatience? Do you sense optimism? We are also in the final hours of Holocaust Day in Israel, so I'm sure that sort of colors the feeling in the street. But for those of us who care about Israel or we're interested in Israel, um, it's sort of hard to be far away when all these things happen. And so I'm wondering what your sense is of the disposition of Israelis these days.
So you used three words there: resilience, impatience, and optimism. I think all of those are there. And the wisdom is trying to, the relative support or weight of those and others. I think Israelis are incredibly resilient. I mean, it's just astonishing in terms of an entire nation being rocketed all the time. Um, this was becoming attritional, and it was deliberate. Iran was not firing um, 10 and 20 missiles at a time. It was firing one or two at a time with cluster warheads that caused, dozens of potential points of deadly impact. And colossal missiles, by the way. The missile that hit a residential building in Haifa and killed four members of the same family, it didn't actually explode. This was the sheer weight of this device destroyed an entire building without its warhead going off. We have a staff member who lives in Bet Shemesh. She lives 500 yards away from where the Iranian missile blew up a synagogue and the bomb shelter underneath it and killed nine people. She's 500 yards away, and her home was, I mean, barely livable, just about livable. All the walls and doors and windows, a fair distance away. And yeah, people deal with it, and they're not happy about it, to put it mildly, and they calculate, you know, do I have to, should I get up in the middle of the night when, I have a relative who's very elderly and not easily mobile. My advice to him was, just sleep. You're in Jerusalem, which has been relatively not targeted. It's just not worth trying to dash to the safe room nearby. And everyone's making those kinds of calculations. I'm not encouraging anybody to do anything other than calmly go to the safest place that's reachable. Um, but at the same time, along with that resilience, I mean, also um, I think most people on this call would know this. We have mandatory military service, 3 years or thereabout for men and women, and then reserve duty. And people tend to do reserve duty through their 20s, 30s, even, a few weeks a year, a month a year, maybe less, maybe a little more, depending on what they do. You've had people who've done hundreds and hundreds of days of the army since October the 7th, to the point where their kids barely recognize them. And I'm not really exaggerating by much in terms of people with younger children. That's an incredible drain on them, on their families, on all of the family structure, right? So there's that, and I think there's frustration. Again, partly because we're at the same time as we're hanging together, there is such disunity. There's such political disunity, and there's, in some cases, deliberately stoked, which is incredibly harmful. And dysfunctionality, like I say, is that, you've got, I watched the mayor of a town in the north on television who's worried about his local population. That's his only interest, protesting that there was a government discussion about the North. I think it was yesterday, and the mayors from the North were not invited to the discussion. And he was like, what is going on here? We need to tell you what we need. You need to be able to ask us so that you can make sensible decisions." So at, like a really fundamental level, I think there's frustration. Then, of course, add in the fact that for most Israelis, there is, it's the golden era, saying to Biden that he would repeat every time he talked about Israel. We have no other country. Um, that's the case for most Israelis. I'm speaking to you with my British accent. Yeah, I have a British passport. I've lived in Israel for the last 40 years. This is my home. But if push came to shove, I could somehow, I could move somewhere else. Most Israelis don't have that option. And even most Israelis who do have that option are not minded to do anything but remain part of this country that we've chosen to make our lives in, because we believe in it and we believe it's necessary. So, there's kind of necessary optimism. We better make sure this country survives and thrives. And by the way, since most of what I've said is so bleak, I don't know what's going on with your currency, but our currency has never been stronger against the shekel, against the dollar, since I think the mid 90s. Um, I don't even begin to understand that, although I know some very senior economists who've tried to explain it to me. We're in the middle of a protracted conflict. Lots of people want to wipe us out. Lots of other people loathe us. Our relationship with our key ally is potentially fraying, but our currency is robust. Our economy seems to be fairly robust. The people are resilient. We're innovative to an astonishing degree. And we have nowhere else that we are comfortable in wanting to be. So we better make sure, or that we feel safe, broadly speaking, as a Jewish nation. You can interpret that, from your perspective in terms of the well-being of the diaspora, which is a whole other webinar in itself. But we better survive this, and we better come through it, and we better not just survive it, but thrive afterwards. And I think that's a massively majority national mindset.
David, you've been wonderful. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your endurance. Thank you for staying up late in Jerusalem. Thank you for this, second, third time that we're talking. And I'd like to thank our audience members for joining us today and for supporting the Helen Diller Institute throughout the years. We hope to see you soon. Please be safe, David.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions, Ron. And thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.